Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar hosted by the Australian POTS Foundation. My name is Celine Gallagher. I'm the Scientific Chair for the Foundation, and we're very excited to present tonight's webinar, which really follows on from the huge success of a very similar webinar that we held this time last year, also with Jen Smallridge and Claire Clark, who I will hand over to introduce themselves in a moment. So tonight is all about answering your questions, which you've already submitted to us. So we've put together what we hope will be a presentation that will answer much of what you need to know about living with POTS. So we're trying to present a balance of both research and lived experience, because we know it can be challenging to implement some of the recommendations for managing this condition. But we think bringing both those perspectives is hugely beneficial, and certainly the feedback we got was very positive last year. So I hope that you will enjoy this evening's webinar as well. Before we do begin the webinar, I would like to acknowledge that we are hosting the webinar from the lands of the Kaurna people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands of which you join us from today. I pay my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining the webinar. I also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. So I will now hand it over to Jen and Claire to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you so much, Celine. And thank you to the Australian POTS Foundation for having me back. We were just reflecting that we can't believe it's been a year. I'll intro myself and the lovely Claire. But I'm an exercise physiologist, and I really just care a lot about chronic invisible illness, to the point where that's now my primary line of work. I work on telehealth as Invisibly Brilliant. And I also co-own a company called Connection Medicine Co., which is dedicated to educating health professionals about chronic invisible illness. So that's how I've landed here this evening, and I'm so grateful for that. And lovely Claire, some of you may know her as the Community Engagement Officer for the POTS Foundation, with a very multifaceted history as a paramedic, a yoga and mindfulness teacher, a scuba instructor, and now a person with POTS who is dedicated to pacing her life and sharing her knowledge and her lived experience with us this evening. So I'm just so thankful for the people who are tuning in, for being hosted, and also for the questions that you've sent through. I know that we've probably just scratched the surface in terms of the many questions that people have with POTS, and information sharing is so powerful in this space. So thank you for joining as well. Tonight, as Celine mentioned, is a blend of the research, the clinical practice and the lived experience, remembering that everyone wears it differently in POTS, and it's really lovely to hear what the evidence does present to us, but also then what anecdotally might be a little tip that could help someone on their journey. So lots of variety out there in terms of what works, but we're going to try and answer those questions as best as we can this evening. And Celine's helping with the first two, actually. We've divided up tonight into some categories, and there were a lot of them to do with diagnosis, prognosis, presentation of POTS, and the medical management that's available at the moment. So the first question, I'll read it out for Celine. It says, I've seen a study saying that postural hyperventilation can cause POTS in 25% of POTS patients. Has anyone successfully treated this and recovered from or improved their POTS? So take it away.
Thanks, Jen. And this is a great question, and certainly something that we hear clinically, because people have read some of these early studies that have suggested that postural hyperventilation. So just to confirm that means that when people are standing up and they're breathing very fast. And when we breathe very fast, we actually lose quite a lot of carbon dioxide. And when we lose carbon dioxide, that triggers a process that can actually increase our heart rate and cause tachycardia. So the thought process was that, we know a lot of people who have POTS, when they stand up, they do breathe fast. And could this potentially be a cause of POTS? And actually, it wasn't really until a study was published earlier this year that we had a little bit more understanding about what drives this postural hyperventilation, or this breathing fast when people are standing and they're living from POTS. So this was a study that was undertaken in Canada. It was actually a really complex study, and it was done in humans and in animals. So they had 25 people who were living with POTS, and they had a control population, so people who they studied that didn't have POTS, and then they had an animal model which helped them to understand things at a basic science level. And as I said, this was a very complex study, but what they determined from this study is that the most likely cause of postural hyperventilation in people who are living with POTS is reduced brain perfusion. So what that means is that when you're in the upright position, we know that one of the issues with POTS is that we're not getting enough blood supply to our brain. So it's what we call cerebral hypoperfusion. Not enough blood to the brain then triggers the heart rate to increase, and also causes a lot of the symptoms that people have with POTS. So, symptoms like dizziness, like lightheadedness, feeling like you might faint, fatigue, brain fog, can all be in part attributed to this reduced cerebral or reduced brain perfusion. So this reduced brain perfusion was the main reason that these investigators identified as driving fast breathing rates when people are standing. And therefore, the conclusion from that is that the most effective way of helping to reduce this postural hyperventilation is really looking at ways that we can improve perfusion to the brain. So this comes back to our really basic lifestyle measures, ways that we look to expand blood volume, so increasing fluid intake, increasing sodium intake, using compression wear, and sometimes also using medications. So a common medication that we use here in Australia to improve brain perfusion is midodrine. So, those sort of steps are really what, based on this study, is most likely to improve postural hyperventilation. And I must say that clinically, that's our experience as well, that when we get those lifestyle measures right, then the hyperventilation, or that feeling of shortness of breath or feeling like you need to breathe fast with standing, is often markedly improved.
Lovely. Thanks so much for that, Celine. The next one says, is there any research being done in Australia regarding the use of nicotine to stimulate the vagus nerve and the associated anti-inflammatory pathway as a treatment for POTS?
Well, I guess the really quick answer is no, there's not. So there has been some preliminary research that has used nicotine patches in long COVID. So, I guess by default, we know that a significant number of people who have long COVID actually have POTS. That is what their long COVID is. So, by default, although the research hasn't been done in POTS, there are some small studies, and these are really just case series. So it's not that we can derive any meaningful conclusions from this research, but it does help us to, potentially understand or, look at treatments for POTS. So this early research of nicotine patches has shown that in these very small scale studies, that it has been, quite effective at reducing some of the common long COVID symptoms, including fatigue. And, some of that in the long COVID population has been thought to be due to sort of nicotine being able to displace the virus from some of the receptors that sit within the autonomic nervous system. So, early research has suggested that nicotine patches potentially have a role, but we don't have any robust research that would support us being able to recommend that clinically. There is at this stage in Australia some government funding that has been granted to some researchers to look at management for long COVID. And again, by default, this will include a lot of people who have POTS, because we know that a lot of people have ended up with POTS from long COVID. But it's really down to those investigators to determine what treatments they will be investigating as part of that study. So there is the potential that that may include nicotine patches, and that may be properly evaluated and will then help us to better make recommendations about whether or not this might be a helpful treatment for POTS. So whilst there's been some early promising research in other conditions, we can't recommend it as a treatment for POTS at this point in time, but watch this space, because I think we'll find out more about that over time.
Absolutely. The next question was, how do you find out what type of POTS you have? I've been told I have POTS by a cardiologist, and I'd like to investigate further and wasn't having much luck down that avenue. And so I think it's always nice to come back to the different types that are being recognised. There's the hyperadrenergic POTS, neuropathic POTS, and hypovolemic POTS. And what you can see in this diagram from a 2021 paper, I think really rings true, is that it's probably not three separate conditions, but a messy overlap with maybe a more dominant contributor compared to the others. So we might consider, instead of separating them, treating the various subtype characteristics and then seeing what sticks and seeing what strategies actually don't serve someone. I am starting to lean towards that theory, and so is the research for sure. In practice, this could look like keeping track of symptoms, triggers, and responses to management strategies and medications. And then this really tells us like what your POTS is. It may not fit perfectly into one of those bubbles, but when you find out your toolkit, that is priceless. And in clinical practice, subtypes are of little to no consequence of the treatment pathway taken and the medications or recommendations that you'll be provided. So most people will know that it's a journey, and everything will probably be trialed at some point, regardless of the subtype or the type that's coming through. And Claire has some lived experience of all the things.
Thanks, Jen. Well, I know for me it fluctuates and changes. And if I had been wanting a definitive, I could have had all three. And this week it's certainly the hyperadrenergic POTS that is leading the way. But obviously, as the warmer weather hits in, I'm going to have lots more blood pooling and more issues with exercise intolerance. So don't pigeonhole yourself, basically, is what I found that works. I think you'll have seen that too in practice, Jen.
Absolutely. I think if you picked one subtype, you could miss out on some potential benefits from treating or looking into the other type. And even in warm weather, if you start to sweat, that does tend us towards hypovolemia with or without POTS. So just being aware of the absolute cluster that is existing here. Thanks, Claire. Still on the diagnostic theme here, we've got a question that says, how difficult is it to get diagnosed and why the reluctance to do the tilt table test? Coming back to really what we have, and there's different versions of this online and in clinical practice, but a bit of an agreed upon diagnostic criteria for POTS. You can see there's that very famous rise of 30 beats in adults from supine to standing, whether that's initial standing or prolonged standing. But it's not just the heart rate and it's not just the blood pressure factor. We're looking at that clinical criteria. It's so not just the heart, as anyone who has it would attest to that. So it's a clinical diagnosis. Therefore, is it difficult to get diagnosed? Well, yeah, there can be a bit of misdiagnosis. This was a 2019 study, so pre-COVID. A large cross-sectional group of people with POTS reported that 75% were initially misdiagnosed or just not diagnosed with POTS or were given something else to play with, leading to a delayed diagnosis and delayed treatment. These days, I'd be really curious in a post-COVID world or, a COVID world. I am certainly finding there's more awareness. When it comes to the tilt table test, Marie Claire has recently addressed this on our social media through the, if you look up the Australian POTS Foundation, there's a really beautiful 2-part video about why and why not, I guess, the tilt table test should or shouldn't be considered. And basically, if any of you have had it who are watching, you would know that it is extremely provocative for symptoms, but it is also a significant test for people even without POTS who are healthy participants who have a tilt table. So it could get a bit of a false positive there. And even someone with POTS, we're actually leaning more and more towards the Nathalie test, pardon the pun. It is a little bit more portable, accessible, and definitely more affordable than the tilt table test, and hopefully leaves people feeling less, it still is going to bring on symptoms, but in a less, I guess, guilty manner. We always want to refer back to the Australian POTS Foundation directory for POTS aware clinicians, and POTS is just one type of orthostatic intolerance. So in terms of getting diagnosed and bringing, I guess, your Nathalie test with you or having a clinician do it with you, just being aware that there are other members of the orthostatic intolerance family, and POTS is one of them. So it's always worth going through those results with a professional. Claire, what was it like for you to get diagnosed?
So I got injured at work, which brought in a work cover element. I then went through super, which brought in independent medical examiners. So all up, seeing all these specialists, I've probably seen 30, 35 people to do with POTS in the last 5 years, and not one has mentioned having a tilt table test. In saying that, I always complete a Nathalie test and also the Malmo POTS score before I attend any new appointments. Even now, I've got one coming up in a couple of weeks, and I've started, digging out, putting all of the symptom log and the heart rates and, triggers, all these factors together, because it's so powerful when you're actually sitting in front of a specialist. Much more powerful than, a 10-minute test doing the actual tilt table test. So my recommendation is go to the website, have a look at the Living with POTS page, print off the Nathalie test, Malmo POTS score, do this on your own. If you don't feel confident to do it on your own, take it to your GP, take all the information to your GP, and then you've actually got some data to talk with them about to actually get diagnosed. You don't have to be spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars seeing specialists and waiting 18 months before you can start getting treatment plans. That's the whole point of our practitioner page. So keep directing them to that and don't focus on purely getting the tilt table test. That's my advice.
And
Agreed.
can I just add one more thing here as well? And that is that, a GP can actually diagnose POTS as well. It does not have to be diagnosed by a specialist. So, doing an active stand test or the NASA lean test, which are, the names for the same tests that we use interchangeably, and ruling out some basic things that may be a contributor to symptoms to make sure that it's not a contributor to the orthostatic symptoms. If you have the results of an active stand test that is consistent with POTS, then a GP is able to diagnose that. There are some lifestyle measures that can be initiated whilst you're waiting to see a specialist. And for some people, lifestyle modification is enough to manage their symptoms. Not everyone does need medications. We will address that a little bit further down the track. And I think another advantage of the active stand test is that it elicits real world symptoms. So a tilt table is not really accurate of what your symptoms are like on a day-to-day basis, because we're not strapped to a table and not activating our skeletal muscles when we're attached to a tilt table. That doesn't really reflect what happens in the real world on a day-to-day basis. So the active stand test is much more helpful at helping us understand what your symptoms are like on a day-to-day basis.
Perfect. Yeah, and actually on that, I've just had a few instances of people who have had a big build up before their tilt table test and a lot of rightful anxiety and worry, and therefore the resting heart rate never truly came down to what their resting heart rate would be, and they didn't meet the criteria for POTS on that day, and it was actually quite devastating and a big exertion in itself. So it's not lost on me that it's trying to capture something and causing anxiety in the interim.
And I think that is a really good point to raise too, Jen, is that, symptoms do fluctuate. If you happen to not meet criteria for POTS on, one particular day, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have POTS. It means that you didn't meet the criteria on that particular day. And that's why testing, on a regular basis is important, because we know that it can change for lots of different reasons. The results of a test done in the morning compared to the evening, the menstrual cycle can impact on your results, summer versus winter. So there are lots of reasons that results may look different. So it's good to have a number of tests and not just rely on the results of one test to inform whether or not a condition is present.
Absolutely. And here's that medication question that we touched on. So can medication be helpful if you have diagnosable but not severe POTS? Firstly, we'll look at the evidence, but we'll also talk about what this looks like in practice. So a recent study in 2024 looked at long-term outcomes for people with POTS, and the people were asked what was the most helpful intervention for you for your POTS. You can see here that the addition of medications, 37.4% of people said that was the most beneficial intervention. And I think that is just worth noting that, there are options out there alongside, of course, the lifestyle management. It tends to be a bit of trial and error is what I've noticed and what I've heard. And if you do have a chance to kind of implement lifestyle strategies early on and maintain them as a constant in the background of medication trials, then I think you'd truly know what's helping and what's not helping. Medications are aimed at symptom management though, and they are there to hopefully improve functional capacity, but they're not curative and they don't change necessarily the prognostic journey. So always an individual decision to make and looking at the risk benefits as well. How about you, Claire, with medication?
My whole POTS journey is a roller coaster, as I'm sure 99.9% of people watching this will agree. So medications absolutely have helped me. There have been times where I feel that the balance of extra side effects for some no longer outweigh the benefits. So I stopped, and then I'll start, or I'll try something different. Being able to log, I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, because obviously I feel really strongly about getting to know your own triggers and being able to identify all of your symptoms, and potentially what's caused it. And when you can sit back and you've actually got that information to look at, it's quite easy for diagnostic help to be able to pinpoint where it is that, you know, if a medication is going to help, where it can actually help. But you're in charge of diet, exercise, stress management, sleep hygiene, pacing, and actually you nailed it, Jem, when you said you've got to stick to it. When I first got diagnosed, I would have a good day and be like, woohoo, you know, I'm kicking pot's butt and I'm going to spend extra time doing the things that I want to do, or extra commitments. And then obviously I'd tip the balance, fall in a heap, and take 3 days to recover. So when I actually recognize that, I plan everything, I map out everything. And yes, it's a big commitment to do it, but long term, it is much better for me to do so. Long way round saying, yes, medications can be great.
It's a long way to everything in POTS. Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone asked if heart rate can go high and low. Obviously, the T is for tachycardia, but yes, we just really want to acknowledge that bradycardia it can exist in POTS. It is a dysautonomia. There's a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. There's not much in the research about this. So we got together and had a chat about maybe if someone was experiencing low heart rate, we kind of just need to know what's happening at that time as well. Is it coming before a high heart rate? Is it coming before a big woozy, fainty episode? Or is it just at random or at rest, depending on the medication that people are on as well? So a Holter monitor test is obviously that very in-depth moment-to-moment heart rate checking that can be recommended, but also you could see here an example of an Apple Watch tracking heart rate continuously and just noticing when the lows are just as much as the highs, depending if they come with symptoms and if they're worrying you. I think that's always worth following up. And Claire's so lovingly included her heart on this slide. Thank you.
Yeah, so that is just a snapshot of my month. I usually put my watch on around 9 o'clock in the morning and I take it off at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that is an unmedicated, zero exercise, other than daily life and living snapshot for you. So at no point at 46 beats do I ever feel like I'm going to keel over and pass out. If I did, obviously I'd be getting it checked.
Yeah, exactly right. This was a good one. Could you please discuss adrenaline rushes and POTS? I've been told it's probably why I wake up at night with a high heart rate, feeling really hot and really nauseous, but I don't understand why and how it happens and what can be done to stop it. So some of you may be familiar with the term adrenaline rush or adrenaline surge. Some of you may know that feeling. It's just, activated, not feeling good, not feeling safe in the body ultimately. The evidence is it's not really there in terms of the phrase adrenaline rush or surge. But we do know that the sympathetic nervous system is impacted in POTS, and this can look like higher noradrenaline in the research, or norepinephrine, you might see it written as, thought to be a lack of clearance ability in people with POTS. The sympathetic denervation in the legs, like a neuropathic presentation of POTS, not squeezing that blood, not reflex-wise, squeezing the blood back up to the center. And a hyperadrenergic state does point to sympathetic nervous system hyperactivation. So adrenaline surges definitely in the people I work with are referred to very anecdotally, and it's a common phenomenon, and it's just a really unpleasant one. I just want to validate that. So in practice, I also just think it's worth noting, particularly if this was happening overnight for this person, we just want to make sure like it is an adrenaline rush and there's no real way to test for that, but making sure it's not something else that can make you feel sick, woozy, high heart rate, including low blood sugar. So just being aware of other things that can mimic the adrenalized feeling. And I often say to people that the nighttime can be a mirror of the daytime stresses on the nervous system. So that can look like a really high exertional day has really broken, patchy sleep, or a high stress day leads to waking up with that high heart rate as they transition between sleep cycles. So pacing, 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 you'll hear us say. Someone has asked if POTS is lifelong. And I've put the reference there. Oh, yes. According to that blood cross-sectional study, again, 63% of people believe that they've always had a tendency to have POTS-like symptoms for most of their lives. And I think that's the word that we're looking at here is tendency. In practice, we always want to keep open to the idea of remission and improvements and feeling better. But I view POTS as like a predisposition that you may have and you may manage it well, or it may become unmasked when you get a virus, you have surgery, you have a big stress or an injury or a hormonal change, which we'll talk about later as well. We also know that some predisposing factors to POTS, such as being hypermobile, we can't change that connective tissue that we know of yet. So people will always maybe be vulnerable to POTS symptoms if strategies have fallen away or if things have gotten really stressy. What's your lived experience, Claire, about the longevity of POTS?
Well, I got POTS suddenly, and that was 5 years ago, and a few other autoimmune conditions have reared their ugly heads to go with it. But it's definitely that roller coaster of some really good periods where there's only a few symptoms. And most of the time I have a handful more. But it really is getting to grips with your own beast, which obviously for some people, the symptoms that they have are very different. And that's why I had a conversation with somebody the other day who has POTS and is quite debilitated with it. And she'd met somebody else that had POTS, and they said, "Oh, I don't know what the big deal is. Like, it's fine. Just I have some salt and I get on with my day," which is, really hard to hear when you are incapacitated and you have very little energy envelopes. My days compared to what they used to be look very, very different. And I'm very aware of my triggers and I minimize them. And you do miss out on a lot. So I have yet to look forward to a day where I haven't had POTS. And I'll look forward to it, really.
Absolutely. Here's the hormones question. We basically took everyone's beautiful queries about beautiful hormones and just hormones discussed. So we just know that different times of life will come with hormonal changes. I love this graph. Also, oh my gosh, the female body is amazing. All the ups and downs of estrogen and progesterone. And really, in summary, anytime there's a big flux in either of those two hormones, we're probably going to feel more of our POTS-style symptoms. But to break it down a little bit further, puberty is a massive time of hormonal change. And in this study, it was the highest time point of onset of POTS. And VVS is vasovagal syncope. So people were more fainty in adolescence and people were definitely more POTSy at that time of massive hormonal shift. Within the menstrual cycle, this is still about puberty. A few, I guess, main predisposing factors here. So having lower blood pressure, having vasodilation, they're definitely impacted by estrogen and progesterone, even things like hypovolemia, having a lower blood volume, having excessive tachycardia. So this paper was specific to puberty. And basically, yes, if someone is going to develop POTS through that mechanism, it's a really tumultuous time, as I'm sure some of you know who are tuning in. And then within the menstrual cycle itself, people with POTS in this study were more lightheaded across the board, across the whole cycle, but particularly post-ovulation, so late luteal phase and menses or during menstruation. There's a query there in the research around, does estrogen then impact blood volume, and are people becoming quite hypovolemic prior to menstruation and feeling just woozy and lightheaded? Certainly possible. Progesterone, this was a rat study, but also progesterone could be impacting the intensity of the blood vessels and could be creating a little bit of relaxation, more blood pooling in the lower extremities, and could explain why females have a lower blood pressure in the second half of the cycle, generally speaking. Pregnancy will change every female's physiology, including increasing the blood volume, increasing heart rate, and slightly decreasing blood pressure, just a standard pregnancy. And this study found that in pregnancy, if someone had severe POTS at the time of conception, their POTS actually got worse during pregnancy. But some people improved because they had an increased blood volume. So it's certainly not a medical recommendation that we would suggest to implement, but more so just noting that, yeah, a lot of medications haven't been tested as safe in pregnancy, but there is a hormonal change that could be helpful or not helpful, depending on the individual. And postpartum, this paper found 50-50. Some people kept improving and some people felt that their POTS was worsening. So unfortunately, it's the flip of a coin here. And then with regard to perimenopause and menopause, no research about POTS in particular, but you can see here that there's just more flux of estrogen and eventually dropping estrogen and progesterone. So that is naturally going to impact someone's POTS. That's going to be tricky, but we don't have enough of a recommendation for that to be hormonally altered, for example, but worth discussing always with a multidisciplinary team on how you can navigate the times of life. In practice, I'm making sure that females have their strategies to lean on in times of hormonal change. That could look like extra salts and fluids in the luteal phase, if they can tolerate compression, but I appreciate pre and during menstruation, it can be really uncomfortable, especially if there's endometriosis. Therefore, encouraging deep rest wherever possible, particularly legs elevated, just to really encourage blood flow back to the heart. And as I touched on, having a multidisciplinary team during pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause and beyond, just people on the team who understand your POTS is going to be really valuable. Lifestyle management was the next category of questions that we received. So let's have a look. Bit of a classic, the raising the head of the bed. I wonder if people watching this webinar have tried it. In my clinical practice, people are like, yeah, it worked. No, it didn't do anything. It was too hard to implement. So just looking at the research from this paper, it does need to be elevated by 10 to 15 centimeters. So that's the bed being fully raised, so blocks or books under the bed head, not just you being raised on a few pillows. The way that this works, or the rationale, is that if you're creating this mild degree of orthostatic stress in the nighttime hours, the RAAS system, I won't try and confuddle myself with those words at this hour, the RAAS system will respond because it thinks it's actually having less central blood volume, so less blood in this area because it's going to the lower half of the body. And ideally, it will kick in and start to lead to more fluid retention and volume expansion, so blood volume expansion. It was also found that for 3 to 4 months of sleeping like this, people improved if they had syncope. So if they were fainted, this actually did kick in. we're not too sure about people with POTS, but it's thrown out there as a recommendation. However, I fully appreciate that standing creates such a yucky orthostatic symptom set and venous pooling. You can just see here in the image, it's just a slightly different style, and it's a lower rate, I guess, of venous pooling compared to standing up and letting gravity do its job. So in practice, it is a different level of orthostatic challenge and tends to be more tolerated than standing, hence why people are being diagnosed with POTS, because it's hard to stand. So that's the bedhead question, I think, worth a try, but not your only strategy. What electrolytes do you use that are affordable and not too acidic? So I reached out to some beautiful colleagues, some are dietitians, some have lived experience, and they shared their little salt hacks with me. I know that Claire's shared her lovely salt bowl before. So lots of different ways that we can just try and get sodium and potassium. It doesn't have to be too fancy. Some people make their own solution with salt and cordial for taste. If you're sensitive to sugar and sweeteners, I've been told that low sugar Bickford has no artificial sweeteners, so I hope that that's the case. I've also been told that Diet Right Heart Salt is 50-50 sodium and potassium, and always worth discussing with a GP about what you should be targeting, or consulting the Australian POTS Foundation website in terms of salt and sodium. Sal Vital is one that gets thrown around. It's low cost, and I've written here effervescent / pleasant. I actually bought it in the lead up to this webinar to make sure I was practicing what I preach, and it wasn't too bad. Yeah, it was okay. It definitely had a high amount of sodium, so that was cool. And then some people like to get really fancy and blitz some salt flakes with water, and there's some flavor drops called Vital Zing just to help with the salty taste. This person recommended the Ancient Lakes electrolyte blend, which had some potassium in it, and then like Celtic sea salt just to get the balance of sodium and potassium. So I think you can like nerd out on your sodium intake, and always sprinkling some on your food. It's not the only intake that you should be getting, but gosh, it all helps, and just getting enough fluids altogether is going to help as well. Here's just a reminder, I suppose, of how salt works. I'll just jump to this question and then I'll go back. So someone has shared, I'm worried I'll hurt my kidneys adding so much salt. Please explain how the salt works, the damage I could do, and why it's worth the long-term risk. So this study, I love this image of just 1 week on a lowered sodium intake or higher sodium intake for people with POTS led to some pretty drastic physiological changes. So if you follow the top row, people who had low sodium intake decreased their blood volume, increased their standing norepinephrine, which often makes people more symptomatic, and increased their standing heart rate. So basically they felt more POTSy. People who upped their salt, total opposite, more blood volume, less standing norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and lowered their standing heart rate. They were less POTSy on paper. Put really simply, water follows salt in the body. So if you're intaking sodium and you're ingesting enough water, we can hopefully boost that blood volume that is often lacking in POTS. But we do have to acknowledge that in healthy populations, and certainly when I went to university, people bang on about the risks of salt. So it can be really confusing as a consumer to navigate this. In healthy POTS, high sodium can lead to that increased cardiovascular risk, and we don't have enough data for long-term use in the orthostatic intolerance and POTS populations. It's best to discuss the risk benefit. Your GP will be able to screen for cardiovascular risk factors, but also in terms of symptom management, it is a bit of a low-hanging fruit, and in the short term, it's not going to, like, people with POTS are not likely to have a raging high blood pressure. So I think we can make those decisions as part of our healthcare team for sure. Someone asked about some alternatives and suggestions for compression garments in hot weather, which is extremely relevant for the season that we're entering. We always like to come back. This is the one study that has assessed the different levels of compression and how it impacted heart rate in people with POTS. And you can see that having no compression, the heart rate was increased by the most in a head up tilt. People with just the lower leg, it really didn't protect them much at all. People with the abdominal compression and upper thighs actually got a nice protective benefit. And people who were wearing full-blown compression had the lowest increase in heart rate upon head up tilt test. So what we can take from this is, if you can tolerate in hot weather, high-waisted shorts, that is worth trialing. But we also wanted to share, not everyone can tolerate compression, full stop. So you've got shorts as an option, maybe an abdominal binder, or even some shapewear, like something being better than nothing. Cold water immersion of the feet and the hands, even just for that passive cooling effect in the hot weather. If we were able to get, let's say, perfect scenario, you could sit on the edge of a lovely cool pool and have your feet and ankles and calves having the hug of the cold water. That would be a lovely option. I'm also a big fan of pacing the posture, so regularly changing positions, looking out for that blood pooling, which is going to be more likely on a hot day, and wherever possible, getting legs up and staying hydrated and salty, and resting. If you can get under an air conditioner, even better. Claire, what's it like for you on hot days, knowing that we've got a few coming up in Victoria?
Yeah, I don't do well in the heat. So I do my schedules on Sundays, and one of the things I look at is what the weather's doing. It's not only heat for me, it's wind, because I'm down the southwest coast of Victoria, and the wind plays havoc with my symptoms. So anyway, sidetrack that. So I will schedule my activities depending on how hot it is. I'll get up earlier. I'll half the amount of time I usually allocate to a task. And I've got 2XU and some skins that I do use, but I don't find them that comfortable, and I don't find that they give me that much whilst I'm wearing them. Although, in saying that, on a very hot day, they do seem to help me. So I also increase all other positive influencing factors. So I use sody, or I've created a whole salt line, depending on what I feel, whether I want some Cajun salt or some lemon pepper salt to dip pickles and stuff in. So I up the ante on those. I also add a couple of litres to the usual 3-4 that I have. And for me, I know that in the morning is the time that I am able to do stuff, because as the day gets on, my activity window that usually finishes around 3 p.m. Sometimes is 11 a.m. And I used to give myself a really hard time about not being productive and not using that time as to what I've allocated. And then I actually had a bit of a realization of, well, by drilling down on what it is that you want to do, is it actually necessary? Do you have to get that stuff done on the days that it is really hot, or could you shelve it for another day? And then this year I upped the ante on that one, and I've actually learned to ask for help, which probably I share the same with a lot of people. We don't like asking for help, but it's a game changer. So, and people obviously, they see you struggling, and if you're anything like me, I actually get a bit narky when I'm struggling to do something, which obviously whoever it is that's on the brunt of that, they don't really like it. Whereas when you flip it and you ask for help instead, they're more than happy to help you. So that's my big tip on this one, is actually just drilling down. Does that task have to get done? If it doesn't, shelve it, put it on another day and rest. And if it does, split the load and just ask somebody to give you a hand. They're not going to care. There you go.
So true. People love to help, and
They
thank you for
do.
giving them the opportunity. And I also acknowledge, Claire, we're so far past your 3 p.m. window. You're doing so well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess this is on topic, and we will be broken records because that's what we do. Can you please share successful ideas that help symptoms other than just salt, hydration, and compression? But now we know that actually shorts are a bit better than salts. I still experience a great deal of fatigue. What are some strategies to manage this? So we've kind of comboed 2 questions here. Straight into the, I guess, my practical clinical bias here. Some of you watching may be very familiar with spoon theory, and we really customize it and personalize it. But it's based on the idea that each day you're given a set amount of spoons, and also take some away if you haven't slept well or you've missed a meal, or I would say on a hot day, take a spoon away, and then you have to allocate that energy allocation, that spoon, the spoons that you're left accordingly. And everyone will have a different 4-spooner. Everyone will have a different 1-spooner in pots. Anything that's upright, I think, is going to instantly have a cost. And you can do anything, but you cannot do everything. And as you just said, Claire, you have to be so discerning. And unfortunately, you do have to prioritize where you may not have had to before. And the discomfort of not completing something or getting something finished or making it perfect, or even having FOMO, I think is something that we don't speak enough about in chronic invisible illness. The feelings of loneliness when everyone's at the party and they're at the thing, but you just didn't have the spoon. And so spoon theory is a great way to pace. Here's another example of how I would assist someone to pace. This is from a Google sheet that I use. The green is like restful, restorative activity, and red is a higher exertion, and orange and yellow are that in between. We don't do this in the long term. This is quite a concentrated what I did, how I felt, what I noticed kind of diary keeping. It is exertion in itself, but definitely worth gathering information, as Claire's done so well over the years, and just sitting down with it and being like, actually, after I do my full shower routine, I need an hour of rest. And the more we know about ourselves, the better choices we can make, and maybe be less tempted to keep doing activity back to back to back and then crashing later. So pacing looks different for every person, and it also depends on flavors of neurodivergence and privilege. Do you have the ability and access to rest fully? That's something that I deep dive in with people, because it's not as easy as just pacing, because otherwise everyone would do it, and we'd not be maybe doing this webinar. That was, I guess, linking in pacing to POTS is thinking about not just the postures and the strategies that support the cardiovascular system, but we need to talk about the central nervous system too. And POTS is an extremely adrenalizing state to be in, because it's trying to keep you alive while you're upright. It's pulling in all the emergency resources we have, and that is exhausting inherently. So the opposite of that survival fight flight mode is restoration, parasympathetic state, and stimulating the vagus nerve is a bit of a shortcut, or at least an attempt to move into a restful parasympathetic state. I often mention to people, like, if they're going to engage with a strategy like deep breathing or humming or doing some cool ear massage, I don't expect a blissful levitation, meditation, Zen state. But can we notice, oh, the heart rate has just come down a little bit from where I was, or I'm actually feeling a little bit less flighty, a little bit less tremory than I was, post-exertion. So I feel like all of these things are a bit of throw everything at it and see what sticks. But Claire, you're no stranger to the vagus nerve, are you?
No, I religiously sing in the shower. But every night I'll do neck stretches and twists. I have like a little mat yoga, 10 minutes that I go through. I did try the cold water therapy, and it made me super amped up and super stimulated to it. So I tried for about a week and it didn't calm down. But I like the idea rather than like full body immersion, like you mentioned earlier, you know, just either standing with your feet in the water or hands, or maybe even just, you know, one of these ice towels, and seeing if that kind of calms you down a little bit. Of course, I went for the full, you know, plunge pool experience, and yeah, I didn't like it.
I love that it wasn't just a dip in the water, it was full body, hardcore. But someone's got to do these experiments, Claire. Yeah. And now everyone knows. Maybe just a splash of cold water. I also, like, it would be remiss of me as an exercise physiologist just to note that if you've got hypermobility, neck stretches and spinal twists may actually be out of your recommended range, or just if you've got a trusted health professional, always talking about some of these strategies before we go into the deep end. And these are your other, I guess, a reiteration, Claire, of the non-typical POTS strategies that you've implemented over the years.
Yeah, so that stick to time allocation is a winner for me, because we do tend to get out and do something, and I'm very good at allocating. I time block and I'll set, you know, 30-minute, 15-minute timers, but if I'm feeling good, I'll be fine. I'll just carry on, and I should know better, because it always bites you on the bum. So when you do your pacing and you map out stuff, stick to what you actually set, whether it's time or whether it's only doing, you know, being creative for a shorter period of time, or chores for a shorter period of time, or even reading. Last month, obviously, I did a heck of a lot of reading, and even that impacted something like that was so nourishing, but I would find that had implications if I read too late or I read too long. And so also for me, recognizing that cognitive load is just as much as physical load. I really wanted to do some little videos for today about just prepping to show you what I had to do to be able to still talk at 7 p.m. But even that went out of the window because I didn't have the spoons to do it. So being consistent with these lifestyle tools and medications, once you get to know what helps you, it's no good if you do it half the time. Like it really is important to continue every single day. And the best thing recently that I've started using is a HRV app, and on the weekend I shared it, and it was I used 3, just I take the best result, and they're a really good way of making visible the your help me out, Jen, your actual system,
like physiological loading, I suppose.
Yeah, and being able to put a number to it, because oftentimes you'll wake up and you'll just be like, oh, you know, I should feel refreshed, I should have energy. Having a look at a HRV app that actually says, ooh, eek, you know, slow down a bit, is like, oh, it's almost giving you the thumbs up kind of to taking the load off rather than keeping going. And I'll stick to this. The most important thing that I found as well is I kind of got symptom log fatigue. So for going through a lot of diagnostic scenarios initially to get diagnosed and then to get proper management, after a couple of years of logging absolutely everything, I I got this kind of like symptom log fatigue where I just didn't want to log anything. And I stopped wearing my watch even like to that point, and started focusing on doing things that I really enjoy. So a lot more art or gardens. And some days it will be, you know, just watching the dogs playing. But I put more emphasis on that. And that really did make a difference to my general overall happiness with doing that whole roller coaster of the chronic illness life. It did help me definitely, and it's something that I implement every single day, is making sure that there is something in my day mapped out that will put a smile on my face and just give me that like little bit of cup filling.
Oh, so important. Deep breath. That was awesome. And it did just make me think, Claire, in clinic and in sessions with people, I'm such a cheerleader. I'm probably annoying to the point where I emphasize, please don't wait for the perfect no symptom day to do that thing that you love. The no symptom day, we don't know when it's coming. But if we stop touching that thing that we love and doing a micro dose, like what's the smallest bit we can do that fits in our pacing and allows you to do the other stuff you need to do. We're humans and we need enjoyment and not deprivation, which POTS can certainly feel depriving of joy and life at times. So thank
Very
you for
much.
sharing your commitment to yourself. It's admirable and necessary.
It feels very wrong to be doing. Like when I was getting diagnosed, you would try and do, if I was having a bad day, I would put off my work chores or other chores, and it'd be like, okay, well, you can't do that today, so put it off tomorrow and you'll have a better day. So I found the days that I was waking up and feeling good, all I was doing was chores or working. And the days that I was having a bad day, I was just like completely bombed. So actually sticking to allocations of like, today's a work day and I really don't feel great. Don't put that off until you feel better, because you're not going to be doing the things that you enjoy when you do have energy. And that, it makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. A little bit more of a logistical question, and I fully recognise there'll be people in the audience here who know more about the ins and the outs of the NDIS than I do. I'm a health professional who works in the scheme, but I'm not a participant. Someone has asked, are you able to get disability help when you are unable to work and do everyday tasks because of it? And what would be the best way to go about this? And someone else asked, is the POTS recognised by the NDIS in Australia? The NDIS website is the home of all things, and they're not so specific in naming conditions. It's more about level of disability and impact on your function. Most certainly there are like even disability support pension. It's a rigmarole and there's hoops to jump. And so just I guess being aware of the fact that what we've gathered and what we've found to be true is that you need to be diagnosed, not just have symptoms, but be diagnosed for at least 12 to 18 months, have adherence to lifestyle recommendations, trialed medications and documented their responses. And if you stopped them, why did you stop? Like just that information gathering exertion is what it is. And also we find that a functional capacity assessment by an occupational therapist appears to be critical, but I fully recognise the cost of all of the above and the difficulties in accessing financial support to then even pay for your healthcare. It's certainly not lost on me. And so that's our very, I guess, quick fire question to a very quick fire answer to a very tricky, convoluted question. And I know as a health professional, I can only hope that accessibility to the scheme increases, or support for people who need it increases, whatever that looks like. But in the meantime, I'm so grateful for the Australian POTS Foundation and other nonprofits just to get good information out there and get people involved in low-hanging fruit, low-cost strategies and connected with beautiful health professionals who just care so deeply about what you're going through. Anything you want to add to that, Claire, Celine?
I can't help with that one, unfortunately.
I will just say, I guess from a clinical perspective, we do have a lot of people who ask about NDIS. It is common for it to be a very long and arduous process. A lot of people just don't feel like they have the spoons to deal with it for a long time. But the more you've done and trialed prior to applying, the more likely it is that it may eventually be approved. It is very common to see multiple rejections, and sometimes it just doesn't ever get through. But we have seen people who have eventually had an NDIS plan approved. But certainly I can't emphasize enough the importance of adhering to all of those, basic lifestyle recommendations, having undertaken that for, at least a 12 to 18 month period, trialing medications. It's really helpful to engage with an exercise physiologist if you can. That just helps to support your case. Psychology appears to be valued by the NDIS as well, just in terms of helping people to adjust to managing a chronic condition. So these are all things that can help to increase the likelihood of an NDIS assessment being accepted, but it typically is a very long process. And we also know that the NDIS is under review in Australia at the moment, and we don't really know what that means from a POTS perspective, whether that's going to make it easier or more difficult. We're just not sure at this point in time.
Thanks for that. Yes, it is a bit of a mystery to me, and I'm seeing people on the scheme and people who are applying, and there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason at this point. So that is the end of our questions. Here are some fun links. I'm sure most of you will be following the Australian POTS Foundation, and I've just included my online clinic and my health professional education link below. But Celine, I'd love to hear if there's anything extra. Is there another slide after this one?
I think you've nailed it.
No, I think
that was the last one. Wonderful.
I will finish up by thanking Jen and Claire for a really fabulously informative webinar. Thank you for making all the effort to be here with us tonight, Claire. I know it's a challenge to be here, but we really
love it. Thank you.
The lived experience inside and also all that you do for the foundation. And this is our last webinar for 2024. So please keep an eye out in your emails for an evaluation form, which helps us to understand what you liked, what we could do better, what you'd like to hear more about next year. Please do follow us on social media, and we will be back next year with our ongoing webinar series. We wish you all a wonderful Christmas and look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again, Jen and Claire.
Thank you, Celine. Thanks, Jen.
So much. And thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.